Mexico. I'm doing my PhD in the University of Bristol. I was invited to chair this panel, I guess because I'm very good friends with one of the organizers, but also because I'm also looking at an alternative account of the drug war or the drug-related violence in Mexico. 2 years ago, I did my fieldwork in the north of Mexico. I interviewed 33 men who used to work for drug cartels. So at the moment, I'm working at, actually I'm looking at these 33 interviews, life stories actually, and my question basically is what are the discourses that these men engage with so they could produce and reproduce drug-related violence. So from my perspective, I'm looking to an alternative perspective, more from a bottom-up perspective. So I'm very happy to chair this panel called Drugs, the Alternative Perspective. So the aim of this panel is to reflect on the origins of the war on drugs and to explore alternative narratives and definitions of drug use. To this end, Emily Craig will talk about how Reagan militarized and therefore created the war on drugs as we know it today. Anna Wilstein will present alternative definitions of drugs from an anthropological perspective, drawing on to examples from her research, Mexican migrant women living in the United States and Jamaican migrants in England. Both presentations call for abandoning the prohibition paradigm and breaking down political biases for and against drugs, which would allow us to integrate them into already existing regulatory frameworks. In terms of logistics, this panel is organized as follows. As you can see, we have a very cozy panel, and each one of them will have 15 minutes to present, followed by 5 minutes of questions and answers, okay? I'll give you 2 minutes notice before you finish your presentations. Okay, so we will start with Emily Craig, who has spent a year as a research assistant at the Global Drug Policy Observatory at Swansea University, where she wrote 2 reports on developments in cannabis policy in the United States. Before that, she worked for 2 years as a research associate at Transform Drugs Policy Foundation, where she contributed to a number of publications, including After the War on Drugs, Blueprint for Regulation, and she has recently co-authored Account the Costs Briefing on the security costs of the war on drugs with the Transform team. Emily has also written a book chapter looking at how the prohibition of drugs impacts well-being and a journal article exploring the global securitization of drugs. She's now working towards a PhD at the University of Bristol, analyzing the securitization of drugs by the United Nations, the United States, and Russia. Okay, Emily?
So I don't know whether I'd really strictly call this an alternative perspective that it's more, I'm going to talk about how we got where we are now. I'm basically, Nixon is often credited with launching the war on drugs. But I'm going to argue that actually it was Ronald Reagan and his wife Nancy who really shaped and militarized the war on drugs as we know it today. So under the Reagan administration, the military was encouraged to get involved in drug law enforcement. Mandatory minimum sentences were increased for drug offences, including the death penalty for drug kingpins. Random drug testing was normalised for US federal employees. And asset seizure laws were strengthened in America and then enshrined into international drug control policy through the 1988 UN Convention against illicit trafficking in narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. Nancy Reagan also contributed to the staunchly prohibitionist atmosphere with her Just Say No campaign that reduced drug use to a yes or no, and shifted the funding away from drug treatment towards abstinence-based programs. The Reagan era introduced and propagated across the world a virulently prohibitionist and highly militarized form of international drug control. So, in 1986, the year that President Reagan signed his National Security Decision Directive 221 that set out how the military and intelligence communities should get involved in the war on drugs. But also in 1981, both Reagans made a series of highly emotive statements on drugs, as you can see some examples here. Illegal drugs are every bit as much a threat to the United States as enemy planes and missiles. Drugs are menacing our society, they're threatening our values, they're undercutting our institutions, they're killing our children. That to me is pretty powerful. And then Nancy as well, drugs, this is all in the same year. Drugs take away the dream from every child's heart and replaces it with a nightmare. It's time that we Americans stand up. There is no moral middle ground. Indifference is not an option. For the sake of our children, I implore each of you to be unyielding and inflexible in your opposition to drugs. So, Nancy Reagan, I mean, there's all sorts of stories about why she got interested in the war on drugs, but regardless of that, this clearly became a passion project for her. She talked about drugs a lot and the Just Say No program. She appeared on US sitcom Different Strokes and Dynasty, promoting Just Say No. So in 1986, when Just Say No was launched, it's an overly simplistic way of looking at drug use, and it obviously doesn't take into account the multitude of reasons why people use drugs. It's interesting to note that also in 1988, Nancy Reagan was the first US First Lady to address the UN. And when she went to speak at the UN General Assembly, she gave a speech promoting Just Say No campaign and calling for a bigger focus on demand control. What I find really interesting is that members of the Reagan administration tried to persuade her not to, because they didn't want her to focus on demand control when their issue was supply control. So I mentioned this National Security Decision Directive 221, which set out how the military could get involved in the war on drugs. But actually, before that, in 1981, President Reagan amended what was known as the Posse Comitatus Act, and that was what stopped the military from getting involved in civilian law enforcement. So he amended that to allow the military to get involved, but this was only at a passive level, so that was loaning equipment and training, rather than actually boots on the ground. But there was a very long debate within the Reagan administration and between Congress and the Reagan administration and the Pentagon and the Reagan administration on how far the military should actually be involved in the war on drugs. So Congress, 3 times in the 80s, 81, 85 and 88, they proposed that the military should have the power of arrest. But this was something that was strongly resisted actually by the military. And I've got 2 really lovely quotes. It's a shame they were ignored, by Caspar Weinberger, who was Secretary of Defense at the time. So first of all, in 1985, when Congress the second time Congress proposed the military having the power of arrest, he argued reliance on military forces to accomplish civilian tasks is detrimental to both military readiness and the democratic process. I like the 1988 one better, calling for the use of the government's full military resources to put a stop to the drug trade makes for hot, exciting rhetoric, but responding to those calls would make for terrible national security policy, poor politics, and a guaranteed failure under war on drugs. Sadly, as I say, he was completely ignored. The intelligence community, however, were far more eager to get involved. And actually, Nixon had mandated for the CIA to participate in drug control in 1972. Reagan mandated for the FBI to get on board in 1981. So the CIA in 1985 wrote a national intelligence estimate purely about the impacts of the drugs trade on national security. Apparently that's quite unusual because normally national intelligence estimates are much broader, so this was a very narrow one. And as you can see, they argue drug trafficking can threaten the integrity of democratic nations. This estimate defines the interrelationship between drug trafficking and other significant issues to our national interests, such as insurgency and terrorism. So there we see the link that's being made between drug trafficking and insurgency and terrorism. And Reagan's National Security Decision Directive 221 was very much based on this. So now I want to talk a little bit about the intensified war on drugs under Reagan. So Reagan, as I say, intensified the war on drugs domestically as well as internationally. So in 1984, Reagan introduced the Sentencing Reform Act, which got rid of parole for most federal prisoners. Also in 1984, there was the Comprehensive Crime Control Act, which enshrined civil forfeiture into the law that allowed assets to be confiscated even before charges had been brought. It also allowed for enforcement agencies, both federal and local, to share the assets that had been seized. In 1986, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act introduced mandatory minimum sentences for drug offences. Also in 1986, Reagan signed Executive Order 12564, which established random drug testing for federal employees. And in 1988, the Drug Abuse Act was amended in order to introduce the death penalty in drug kingpins. Now, often, as I said, people say that it was Nixon who declared the war on drugs, but if you actually look at prison populations, you can see that the sharp incline really happened under Reagan. Because Nixon spent 70% of his federal drug budget on treatment rather than locking people up. And that's why I argue that although he clearly started a rhetorical war on drugs, Nixon, I don't think the actual policies that he followed through can really be called a war. Whereas Reagan's very, very clearly armed and then very militarised. But even at the time, some of these policies were opposed. And the Washington Post, in an editorial, argued that the best way to deal with the drug problem was education and treatment, and that federal workplace testing, military involvement and civil law enforcement, and mandatory minimum sentences undermine civil liberties. However, that was ignored. It's also interesting to note that the stringent asset forfeiture and seizure laws, many argued, undermined the Fourth Amendment of the US Constitution that prevented US citizens from being searched without probable cause. So now the internationalization of US-style war on drugs. So during the 1980s, a new threat was being articulated, that of the narco-terrorist. Now that didn't actually originate in the United States. It was first used by the Peruvian president in 1983 in response to the rise of the Shining Path, or Sendero Luminoso. However, both Reagan and George Bush Sr. and Jr. Both used the narco-terror threat as a cover for anti-Sandinista policies in Central America. Shortly after Reagan signed the National Security Decision Directive 221, the US sent 6 Black Hawk helicopters and 160 military personnel into Bolivia with the aim of eliminating cocaine processing labs. Although even at the time they argued that this only had a very, very limited impact on price and availability. And it also really angered the locals who saw it as an attack on the peasants. So also in 1986, the US amended the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, and this established the policy of certification. The amendment stated that international narcotics trafficking poses an unparalleled transnational threat in today's world, and its suppression is the most important foreign policy objective of the United States. I don't think that was true even at the time, but And so in order to make producer and transit countries toe the line, certification required that the US President certify that specified drug production and transit nations were cooperating fully with the United States in a range of stipulated counter-narcotics measures. If countries were deemed to be not cooperating, they could face suspension of US aid and US opposition to loans from regional and multilateral development banks such as the World Bank and the IMF. Also in 1986, the US pulled together all their ambassadors from drug-producing and transit countries, as well as some of their so-called allies in the war on drugs, and told them to impress upon their host nations how much importance the US attached to fighting the drug war. So they were clearly trying to push their message and get as many countries on board with their vision of international drug control. Later, after Reagan, so in 1999, Colombia's president requested US assistance and emphasized the need for development and social priorities over law enforcement and military agendas. But the US wanted the focus to remain on the drug war. Of the $860 million given, almost 3/4 went to security agencies, and only 1/4 was earmarked for economic development and other social priorities. That kind of reflects what Danny was talking about with the policy displacement that the UNODC recognised as one of their unintended consequences. Since then, the US has instigated a series of similar programs, such as the Andean Initiative, the Merida Initiative, that focus on bolstering the ability of the military and law enforcement agencies in the region to reduce the supply of drugs into the US and fight the narco-terror threat. So further internationalisation. In the late 1980s, it was decided that they needed another UN drug control convention. This one looking particularly at trafficking. So this culminated in the 1988 UN Convention against illicit trafficking in narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. The US argued that they had considerable experience in developing effective law enforcement tools against traffickers, and therefore they incorporated into the treaty US-style law enforcement measures such as asset seizures, special investigative techniques including electronic surveillance and undercover operations. The US then also used the 1988 UN Convention to legitimise the certification process by adding in a clause saying that the President had to quantify how far each country had gone to meet the goals of the 1988 Convention. So the 1988 Convention can also be seen as a further internationalisation of yet more broad US approaches to drugs and organised crime. Reagan built upon the war on drugs discourse that had been created by Nixon, but he went much, much further. He militarised the war on drugs and then internationalised these aggressively prohibitionist policies. Later presidents and other national leaders only increased in this direction. Under Clinton, you had Land Colombia. Under George Bush Jr., you had the merging of the war on terror and the war on drugs. But also we can see that in Mexico with the 2006 war on drugs. So I would argue that the US has influenced the direction of international drug control through policies enshrined in the 1988 Convention and through joint counter-narcotics operations, massive funding and support for training programs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. Questions? We have 5 minutes for questions. All right.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. I have a question. The story you told about the kind of domestic war on drugs, and I completely agree with you that it's more Reagan, but it's focusing a lot on the figure of the president. What about the kind of the influence of the parents movement, kind of the very organized drug-free America writing campaigns, so kind of more what we see now in terms of reform movement at that point in the late 70s and 80s is more one that actually demands tougher drug policies. And then the other one, that there were also like political incentives for elected politicians in the Senate and the House of Representatives to kind of one-up each other on tougher drug legislation, because it's a time of the kind of crack epidemic, all these stories coming out. So if you could say something about the kind of the interaction of these factors of not just kind of the role of the executive, but also other social and political forces.
Well, definitely. I mean, the parents' groups very much head into the just say no narrative, and I think they both fed off each other. So I absolutely agree with that. I think Nancy just became a figurehead for that movement and used her kind of power and political capital in order to spread it beyond and internationalise it. As I said, she went and spoke at the UN, and she organised her first wives meeting of all the wives of the leaders of the time. She had a strong connection with Mrs. Gorbachev as well. So I'm not taking away from that, absolutely. I guess I had a limited amount of time, so that's why I particularly focused on the Reagans. In terms of the political situation, yes, absolutely, and particularly in 1986, because we had midterm elections, Congress was almost fighting with the Reagan administration to seem the toughest, but also the Republicans and the Democrats were fighting against each other to seem the toughest. And that's why you had the Anti-Drug Abuse Act in 1986. So there's absolutely, it's like a feedback loop, really. They all feed into each other.
Looking to that, so far the responses that we've seen to the rising heroin epidemic in the US, particularly from social actors and parents, have been compassionate and have been inclined to give priority to treatment. But there are already signs pointing to the blaming game, particularly from the DEA, and there is a clear link between the rise of that epidemic and an increase in production in places in Mexico, clearly in Guerrero. How do you see that playing out in terms of drug policy in the US in the near future?
I mean, I'm not really an expert on current drug policy in the US. I'm very much looking at the past. I mean, I could make broad observations, but you know, I'm definitely not. This is not something that I would consider myself an expert on.
I think one of the explanations for the different response, compassionate now versus punitive then, was the nature of the people we're seeing dying from this epidemic. Now it's middle-class white people. In the late 80s, it was considered to be, even though it wasn't, a problem of black people in the city. And the response to black people in the city in America is always to crack down. Whereas the response, I mean, even the actual, talking about the 1986 acts, there was discussion in Congress at the time, when it was specifically stated to be about protecting, I quote, the cream of American youth from these evil drug dealers. We're talking about protecting white people from black people rhetorically. My question is, you've got several fascinating quotes there, and my particular favourite was when they said that the suppression of the drug trade was their number one foreign policy priority, which clashes so starkly with their practices in the 80s of facilitating the cocaine trade directly into the US from the Central American region into the Contras, and also facilitating the creation of an Afghan heroin market in order to support the Mujahideen. So how was the cognitive dissonance dealt with at the time? Was that a general statement across the foreign policy board in the US that drug suppression was their number one priority? Was there dispute within the foreign policy establishment of the US about that?
Well, it's really fascinating that, because at the time they said it's our number one priority, it's our major issue. But I've been reading memoirs of a lot of the people in the Reagan administration, no mention of drugs at all, none. Reagan mentions it only in relation to Nancy, which I find really fascinating, so that makes me wonder how much of a concern it genuinely was. And obviously in Latin America it was very much to do with the Reagan doctrine and the threat of Soviet expansion. And I think in a way the drug threat was a useful way of doing things that they kind of wanted to do, but perhaps felt they couldn't justify in other ways.
Okay, thank you very much. We can have a couple of minutes for general comments and questions at the end of the presentations, okay? Right, thank you, Emily. Now we will listen to Anna Wallstein, who is a lecturer in medical anthropology and ethnobotany in the School of Anthropology and Conservation at the University of Kent. She is also co-founder of Breaking Convention, a multidisciplinary conference on psychedelic consciousness. Anna's research focuses on medicinal plants and health sovereignty among Mexican migrants in the United States and Jamaican migrants in the United Kingdom. Her most recent work has been with the Rastafari community, looking at issues related to spirituality and embodiment. She has also published work on medical marijuana and on the use of cannabis in Rastafari. Anna?
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Yeah. Okay. Oh, thanks. Hi, so thank you again to the organizers for the invitation to be here, and thank you to everyone in the audience for coming to listen. I'm sorry, my voice is a bit scratchy today, so I will, hopefully you'll be able to hear me. I'll try and keep my throat as clear as I can, but if I cough a little bit, please forgive me. Oh, thank you. Okay, so I am going to be presenting something a little bit different from what we've heard today so far. I am an anthropologist, as Karina mentioned, and an ethnobotanist, and realized that perhaps I might be one of the few people in the room who actually knows what ethnobotany is, maybe. Don't worry, I'm used to that. But ethnobotany is the study of relationships between people and plants. And it's sort of it's a very multidisciplinary field, but two of the main fields are botany, as you might expect, and anthropology. Now, so I'm not an expert in drug policy or anything like that. So what I want to start by talking and really looking at today is backing up even further. Not why did the drug war fail, or what started the drug war, or who started the drug war, but going back to the very, very fundamental question: what is a drug, actually? Because drug is a very nebulous category. Now, sort of implicitly, my impression is that when we talk about the war on drugs, we're talking about the war or fighting against or resisting a very eclectic mix of substances. These are substances that alter human consciousness in some way and or are associated with addiction and problems of addiction. But that's a really, really broad category, and it includes everything from marijuana to LSD to crack cocaine. And those substances all have very different histories. Materially, they're very, very different. And in terms of production, they're all very, very different. Now, I also teach ethnopharmacology, which is similar to ethnobotany, but it looks specifically at how people make plants and animal substances, but mostly plants, into medicines, and the relationships between people and these medicines. And so as a graduate student, I took a few classes in pharmacology. And in my pharmacology classes, they told us on the first day that pharmacology is about the study of drugs in the body. And they had a very, very specific, and it was in the textbook as well, very, very specific definition of a drug. And that's a small molecule that has some kind of physiological effect in a living organism. As I said, usually when we talk about the war on drugs, we're talking about dangerous or substances that are perceived to be dangerous and potentially addictive. they could also be a concentrated, synthesized, and or refined substance. I mean, this is really what that small molecule is about. It's specifically talking about single molecule substances. So things like, plant materials, even cocaine or opium. There's more than one molecule in there, and there's more than one molecule in there that has an effect on our bodies. And as I said, there is this preoccupation with the substances that affect our consciousness. Now, in my work as a medical anthropologist, I didn't start out looking at, let's just say, illicit drugs. I started out looking at home remedies that were used in Mexican migrant families in Athens, Georgia, in the southeastern United States. So I was working with a community of migrants who were autonomous, so they did not have express permission from the United States government to cross into U.S. territory, and they were living and working without express permission to do so. They found other ways of getting into the country and other ways of finding employment and building communities and sustaining their families. And so, like I said, I was interested in home remedy use because one of the things about migrants that don't have formal permission to be in the United States is they suffer a lot of hardships and stresses, as you may imagine. And one of the things is they're excluded from professional medical care in many parts of the United States. And so I was looking at their use of home remedies as one explanation for how they stay healthy, because the strange thing about the United States is that migrants from Mexico and other Latin American countries are actually much healthier than most American citizens. And it's something known as the Hispanic health paradox, which you can look up if you're curious about that. Maybe I can say more in the questions. And so migrants, I was mainly focusing on migrant women because they have the bulk of the hearing duties in their families. And they knew quite a bit about medicinal plants. Their pharmacopoeias were smaller than the pharmacopoeias of people in Mexico because it was a little bit more difficult to find certain species that maybe they were used to in Mexico. But a lot of the most popular species, things like chamomile and mint and rue and basil, could be found or grown quite readily in the United States. And it was indeed a lot of these herbal remedies that they were relying on. They had a very strong preference for these herbal remedies. And one of the things that I found was that they actually sometimes, it wasn't always the case that they didn't go for professional medical care because they couldn't access it. In fact, in Athens, where I was working, they could access, at least the public hospital it was a safety net hospital. So they had a very well-funded low-income assistance program, and they did not ask people about their migration status. Anybody could join, and in fact, I never met a Mexican in the community I was working in who tried to sign up for this and was denied. So they all had it. They could access the hospital and all the hospital's outpatient clinics, but they preferred to use herbal remedies because they perceived them as safer and cheaper and more effective. So not going too deeply into the methodology because I don't really have time, one of the things that I was interested in was how these migrant women were classifying different medicines. And so we did like what's known in ethnobotany as a pile sorting exercise, where you have like cards with the names of, we'll just say remedies, for lack of an all-encompassing term, and ask them to sort them however they wanted. And then through some statistical analysis that I'm not going to go into, I produced this multi-dimensional scaling plot. And what comes out is there were basically 4 categories of medicines. They grouped all of the sort of herbal remedies into one group. Up here you have the pomadas or the salves, the sort of topical stuff that you rub on the skin. These were non-herbal, but home remedies, so things like Alka-Seltzer and baking soda, and maple rum are important. And then over here, you have the pastillas, the pills, the pharmaceuticals. And the interesting thing that I found was that Tylenol is like one of the most popular brands of paracetamol in the United States. And so women talked a lot about Tylenol in particular. They would use it because you could get it over the counter and it's effective for pain relief and for fevers, and some of the kids had fevers, they gave them baby Tylenol. But a lot of the women, it emerged in interviews, were very cautious about Tylenol, and they talked about it, well, indeed they said, es como droga. No es medicina, es como droga. It's a drug. It's like a drug. And the reason why they said it's like a drug is because they said, I know somebody and she takes it and then she takes another pill and it's just increasing it. It's like an addict. You have a little headache and you grab the pills. You have a little backache and you grab the pills, and more and more and more. And several women, I had conversations like this with them. And the interesting thing is that when I presented this years ago at a conference, I can't even remember who it was, but someone in the audience actually suggested, well, actually, there is some evidence that NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, of which Tylenol is one of them, actually can be addictive. Really? And so then I did some research into this back in 2006 and published a little bit about it in an article in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology. And it turns out that actually, yes, because when you take pain with NSAIDs like Tylenol, they work by stopping the inflammation process, our body's natural inflammation process that can sometimes get out of control and result in really high fevers or result in really high levels of pain. But actually, what inflammation is, it's like you cut yourself, blood rushes with all those immune system cells, which are in the blood, and you get swelling and redness, but it's bringing all those things. And if you let it resolve naturally, then in a healthy person it does resolve. If you keep taking the NSAIDs, it blocks the process, so it never resolves naturally, and actually it gets worse. When the drug wears off, it gets worse, and then you take more, and then it wears off, and it gets worse, and then you take more. So I thought that was very interesting, and kind of argued that it shows how sophisticated the ethnopharmacological knowledge of these migrant women actually is, that they're able to observe this in themselves and other people and identify this addictive sort of effects. So this is a case where the category of drug is not broad enough. My more recent work, when I moved here to the United Kingdom, and although there certainly are obviously Mexican students here in the UK, there aren't like whole populations of multi-generational families like you have in the United States. So I switched to working with migrants from the Caribbean, mainly from Jamaica. Again, starting out, looking at issues related to herbal medicines. One thing led to another, and in about 2011, I got involved with Rastafari. And one of the things that I was very interested in Rastafari is their use of cannabis. Now, Rastafari has a very, very strong influence on the general Jamaican population, both in Jamaica and among Jamaican migrants here in the UK, and presumably also in the world, I would imagine. Rastafari started out, it was, they were discriminated against, they were thrown in jail for growing dreadlocks, they were thrown in jail for smoking marijuana, for having their ceremonies and whatnot, but it really has become mainstream. And it's, when you know what to look for, it's very, very clear to see how much of an influence it has on everyday Jamaicans who who maybe don't self-identify as Rastafari, but they probably had someone in their family who was Rasta, and that person probably had an influence upon their lives. So among Jamaicans, cannabis, herb, is just that. It's an herb. It is not a drug. Jamaicans, they will talk about drug. There's unfortunately, a lot of crack cocaine in the Jamaican community, and some people also smoke heroin. They tend to stick to the things that you smoke. But there is a very, very big difference between smoking herbs and smoking drugs. And also, they see a very, very big difference between dealing in herbs and dealing drugs. So there's this real sort of cultural clash. Herbs, it's an agricultural product. At its worst, it's seen as a slightly safer alternative, smokable thing to tobacco. At its best, it is the most sacred plant in the Rastafari pharmacopoeia, and it's widely known by Rastas and non-Rastas alike as the healing of the nation. It's a very important, sacred, medicinal plant, spiritual plant, that can be smoked in pretty much any case, pretty much any time, in the morning, in the day. You can smoke it and it helps you work, especially physical labor. This is what keeps people back in Jamaica, people who still work in the fields in agricultural production. This is what keeps them going throughout the day. So it's a very, very different sort of a thing. So this is a case where the definition of drugs is too broad, and cannabis herb is really not seen as a part of that. Many Jamaicans may in fact be in favor of the war on drugs, but not on cannabis, because that's not a drug. It's not a drug at all. Just to wrap up, the problem with defining drugs as these substances that affect consciousness or are potentially addictive, as I've said, it covers a really broad range of materials. And, in many cases, many drugs are illicit because of social reasons and cultural reasons more than for the biological harms that they actually cause. And these problems become worse when there are these cultural misunderstandings about what should be included in the category of dangerous drug and what should not be included in the category of dangerous drug. So perhaps increasing I'm an anthropologist, so of course I would say this, but increasing cross-cultural learning and communication about how different substances, which we may or may not classify as a drug, function in society and become part of society, and what is very, very important. And I think that it would help us to kind of break down some of the stigmas around certain substances that in fact are, perhaps even safer than many of the pharmaceuticals, even the over-the-counter pharmaceuticals that are available. And that we have these regulatory frameworks for herbal medicines, like cannabis and ayahuasca, maybe even magic mushrooms, even though technically they're a fungi and not a plant. And I'm going to stop because I think I'm out of time. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, Anna. Really interesting. Questions? We have 5 minutes. Questions?
It's a question. These drugs that you can find in the pharmacy, like antidepressants or these kind of drugs, which are already, let's say vitamins. They kind of keep people fit in the system, so they work for the system. But for example, marijuana, I found that people who smoke marijuana at some point, they may become underachievers, but most of the times they stop being rampant consumers. You know? They stop working as dogs, just make money just because of it, and that happens many times. So that doesn't work for the system. You know? So do you think that's the reason why that it's difficult for the marijuana to become illegal and widespread?
To become
I mean legal.
Yeah, I do think that has a lot to do with it. You know, it being a plant used for spiritual purposes like meditation and prayer and healing. I mean, these are patently antithetical to capitalism and to consumerism. And yes, potentially that is one of the reasons why the powers that be who are sort of running the consumerist capitalist machine don't like it. I don't think it's the substance alone. I think there are also cultural reasons why some people would opt to focus more on healing or spirituality rather than consumerism. But I think that for people like that, the cannabis does resonate very well with them. And no, they don't fit into mainstream, but to them, that's kind of the point. They don't want to fit in. They see a better future for humanity dismantling that system than trying to fit into it. That's a bigger question we're here to really focus on today. Okay. Any other questions?
Do you have any potential answer to why some substances are regarded as more dangerous than others? Like, for instance, why is it that Tylenol or alcohol have a socially better acceptance compared to marijuana or other kind, like cocaine or heroin? Like, for instance, why is it that if at some point some pharmaceutics gets the way of getting, I don't know, or like why is it like the medicinal use of marijuana is still not widely accepted in the society? So is there like an anthropological reason of why some drugs are better accepted than others? Or is it just economically wise or monetary wise?
That's a good question. Yeah. It does have something to do with the law, but then it's sort of a circular question: why are they illegal in the first place? You know, people don't like them because they're illegal, but why are they illegal in the first place? An anthropological reason why. Again, I think it actually, from an anthropological perspective, I think it comes down to who is attached or associated or stereotyped with the different substances. So marijuana, you get the stereotype of the underachieving hippie, or the, you know, just the so out of touch spiritual mystic, you know, that don't fit into society. You know, with cocaine, you maybe associate like powder cocaine with the sort of upper class jet set, and so it's kind of, you know, a blind eye is turned to a lot of that sort of cocaine use. But then with crack cocaine, it's associated with poor black people. And, you know, nobody in power likes poor black people. I think they're, you know, the most dumped on